President Donald Trump says the United States is holding good talks with Iran and believes a deal is possible. But he warned US airstrikes would resume if negotiations fail. Tehran says Washington is struggling to find a way out of the conflict that's been going on for 5 months now.
And we're talking right now. You know, they wanted to talk. Their people said, please don't shoot last night, the night before, 2 nights. Don't do it. You know, we're having good talks. So we'll see what happens. I think there's a good chance that something could happen. And if it does, good. If it doesn't, we go back to doing what we were doing 2 days ago.
Paul Musgrave is here in the studio with me. He's an associate professor of government at Georgetown University in Qatar. Let's pull all of these threads together, Paul, if we may. Let's start with Donald Trump there, because Washington insists that it is engaged in, quote, very deep talks with Iran. Tehran's foreign ministry is flatly denying direct negotiations. Everything seems to be going through intermediaries right now. How should we read that diplomatic disconnect? Are both suggesting that they have an appetite to move things forward diplomatically while at the same time making sure that their armies and weapons are on standby?
Well, both sides have an incentive to say that talks are or are not ongoing. Donald Trump wants to be able to show the American people that he's making progress, or at least exhausting every avenue before resorting to military force again, if that becomes necessary in his judgment. The Iranian government doesn't want to say that they're talking to the Americans through any possibility. So you have to read these statements in that light. On the other hand, it does seem like talks are proceeding, at least, as we heard from Rasul, over the Strait of Hormuz. And you see some softening of the Iranian position, some creative diplomacy and uses of formulas like the Malacca model to make some sort of an agreement over the Strait of Hormuz possible. You know, we're dealing with very big issues here. The nuclear program, ballistic missiles might come back into play, and of course the Strait of Hormuz. Everybody understands that military options might come back to the fore, but neither the United States nor Iran has any substantial desire to go back to a large-scale military conflict. I think the wild card that a lot of people are looking at today is what happens when President Trump meets Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu in Washington as part of the funeral of Senator Lindsey Graham, one of the most ferocious Iran hawks, and somebody whose passing has really influenced U.S. foreign policy in Ukraine and Israel.
Let's start with the Malacca Strait model that you've just mentioned there, because Oman appears to have presented this proposal to the Iranians. Malacca Strait obviously being that key waterway between the Indian and Pacific Oceans, between the Malay Peninsula and Sumatra. It's Singapore, Thailand and Malaysia that administers that waterway. This isn't entirely new. We know that both Iran and Oman have suggested joint management of the strait in the past. So is the suggestion that this is different, that may potentially be more agreeable to Iran? What do we understand is going on here?
Well, based on Rasul's reporting, it sounds like the Omani proposal would have much more room for regional consultation. And the proposal there reflects the reality that for members of the GCC, the Strait of Hormuz is an economic lifeline. It's where exports and imports come into, and it's something that, despite people talking about large-scale infrastructure projects, it's going to be very hard to replace. That model recognizes the importance of this. The Iranian proposal, as Rasul was reporting, really requires a two-country Muscat-Tehran, a condominium over the strait, in which, almost by definition, Iran would have the upper hand. The strict Malacca model is one about voluntary, cooperative, problem-solving management of the ecological and navigational challenges in having a huge maritime waterway. If that really were the outcome, that would be something that's compatible with international law. That's something where there's a good model, and would also avoid the kinds of international condemnation and potentially widening of conflict that an Iranian insistence on making the Strait of Hormuz a domestic Iranian passageway would have.
Right. So if there is a point of agreement between Oman and Iran over this, it's that, OK, potentially fees can be charged for vessels transiting through the strait. We don't yet know the details of how that might work. The point where they diverge is over this issue of a consortium, right? The idea that other GCC states may have a say or a degree of influence over that protocol. Why might Iran be squeamish about not being the dominant force in that arrangement. Why are they concerned, do you think, about the GCC being part of a consortium?
Well, Iran has learned over the past several months that it has an effective veto of the physical transfer of cargoes through the Strait of Hormuz. To hardliners, that looks like a lever that they can use to exert their influence over this region. On the other hand, they don't have the ability to allow their own Navy, their own cargo to go through the strait unilaterally. The United States has shown that it has a veto over that. So for Iran, the question of who gets to set those fees, whether they are mandatory, how they are described, that is something that really matters because it cements the degree, the formal recognition of Iranian influence. If the GCC has a greater say in this, then that actually means that this is part of a more lasting security architecture. You know, folks in the GCC, I think, understand very well that Iran is not going to go away, that there needs to be some sort of a new equilibrium established. But Kuwait, Bahrain, and Qatar in particular all have real interest in making sure that that strait can be used and that it's not going to be closed off arbitrarily. You know, James Madison once wrote that the power to tax is the power to destroy. And that, I think, is something where if Iran has the ability to really just tax that strait, then you could have something that looks like a much more formal, much greater degree of Iranian hegemony over this region.
The irony is that before Iran and the United States began this war against Tehran, Israel and the United States, I should say, that waterway was open to all international traffic. We're talking about a complete change of the status quo because of decisions made in Tel Aviv and Washington. As you say, Netanyahu is going to be sitting down with Donald Trump. President Zelensky is going to be there as well, both of them for Lindsey Graham's funeral, as you say, a hawk when it comes to both Russia and indeed Iran. Do we expect Netanyahu to have Donald Trump's ear at the same time that all of these negotiations are going on around the future of the Strait of Hormuz?
I think that Prime Minister Netanyahu, it's on the public schedule. He's going to have a chance to make a case to Donald Trump. Netanyahu, of course, under political pressure at home, his own personal popularity, the popularity of his coalition suffering, looking forward to those general elections in October. One of the things is that Netanyahu's stock and the stock of Israel in the United States has really plummeted as a result of this war, as a result of the choices that were made back in February. And whereas back in February, Prime Minister Netanyahu could make a direct pitch to President Trump that, President Trump was very receptive about how this war would go. Now we've seen that this wasn't a quick in and out excursion. This was, in fact, something that led to something that many people describe as a quagmire, even a defeat. And I think that President Trump is probably going to be a much more skeptical audience. That doesn't mean that he's going to say no to whatever Prime Minister Netanyahu is pitching, but it does mean that I think there's going to be much more resistance than there would have been 4 or 5 months ago.
Yeah, Trump's words when it comes to a breakthrough, either it goes fast or not at all. Clearly, his patience is running thin. Paul, really good to get your thoughts, as always. Paul Musgrave, Associate Professor of Government at Georgetown University of Qatar.